الأخير، نقاتل بعزمنا وما لنا نظير، نقاوم للرمق الأخير، نقاتل بعزمنا وما لنا نظير، نقاتل وشعبنا قوافل، ودربنا التحرير، ودربنا التحرير من بقاع الأرض إلى كل الأسر. نقاوم للرمق الأخير،
نقاتل بعزمنا وما لنا نظير،
نقاتل وشعبنا قوافل، ودربنا التحرير، ودربنا التحرير من بقاع الأرض
إلى كل أسير.
بيمضى ليل بيبقى ليل، تحت جناحه بيبقى خوف الذل الويل. ما تخافوا مهما طال ليل الظلم يا ناس، بيرجع بيطل نهار يحمل الفرح للناس، وبينكسر هالليل. مهما تجن الريح وعليك تقوى النار، ضلك بوش الريح ما تزيح مهما صار.
مهما تجن الريح وعليك
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to CIGA's second international conference on Palestine, challenging apartheid in Palestine, reclaiming the narrative, formulating a vision. Today is day number 5, and we are on our 10th session, Tuesday, June 22nd, 2021. I am delighted to introduce the session chair for today. His name is Mr. Fadi Zatari from CIGA as well, who will be talking about the future of the Palestinian struggle, analysis, and prospects. I'd like to briefly introduce him. He is a research associate at the Center for Islam and Global Affairs and lecturer in political science and at Istanbul Sabahattin Zaim University in Turkey. He has a lot of different academic achievements. He is fluent in many different languages, and he is a resident at CIGA's conferences, a very familiar face to all of us. Please take it away, Mr. Fadi.
Okay. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Yasmin. I would like, first of all, to welcome you once again, to our second international conference on Palestine. Now we have a great session, I hope, inshallah. It will be about the future of the Palestinian struggle, and we have 4 distinguished scholars. And this is, of course, session number 10. And we will start with Professor Hilke Baumgarten. Professor Hilke Baumgarten is from Birzeit University, and she taught at the political science basically from 1993 till 2020. And she is also one of my professors at Birzeit University when I was doing my master degree in international studies more than 10 years ago. Professor Baumgarten wrote a lot of books on Palestine, on Hamas, and Fatah, and some of them on bibliography on like Yasser Arafat. She is known for her academic career in Palestine and for building also the University of Birzeit, establishing several programs, especially the Human Rights and Democracy program, as well as the PhD Social Science program. I'm very happy to have you. She will be talking about examining the realities on the ground, a hard look at the facts. That will be followed by the next speaker. The next speaker will be Mr. Mu'in Al-Tahir. Mr. Mu'in Al-Tahir, he was also in different, he wrote on Palestine. He is very known for his writing on Palestine, and he is the project coordinator for the research and documentation on Palestine issues at the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies, and he will be talking about the future of the Palestinian National Project, exploring the Palestinian options, and that will be followed by Mr. Mu'in Rabbani, who is also from Jadaliyya, and he also published in Palestine, very known for his contribution on Palestine. He is an independent analyst as well as a research specializing in Palestine, Palestinian affairs, and the Arab-Israeli conflict. And he will be talking about the US administration and the question of Palestine. And after that will be the last and not the least, Dr. Muhammad Makram Balawi, who is a Palestinian writer and academic based in Istanbul. We know him also from CIGA, and we know him from a lot of activities, and he will be talking about the normalization and resistance in the Arab and Muslim context. We are very happy. I'm very happy to host this session. Every speaker will have 18 to 20 minutes, and after that we will have a discussion. It's more conversation, so everyone can participate. I will be asking you several questions, and you can interfere and comment just without any regulation. So we will start with the Professor Baumgarten. Yeah, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. First of all, thanks very much for the organizers of the conference. It's a tremendously impressive conference, and I would just love to be in Istanbul and meet all the people you have invited. So hopefully this will be possible in the next years. Well, let me start today with a very personal introduction. I want to start with the view I have from my window in Beit Hanina. For those of you who are not familiar with Jerusalem, Beit Hanina is a village north of Jerusalem, alongside the historical road Gaza, Jerusalem, Nablus, and the village was annexed to Jerusalem after the June War in 1967 and has now turned into a suburb of the city. If I look out straight ahead in the southern direction, I see the settlement of Ramat Shlomo. It was built starting in the early 90s, in 1995, on land confiscated after 1967 from the village of Shafat, north of Jerusalem, to build a green belt called the Tedikolek forest around Jerusalem. Then in the early 90s, suddenly trucks started to move into the forest. The trees were cut down and they had to make place for a new settlement, which was built in 1995, continuously expanded and has now about 20,000 settlers living in it. Further to my right, direction southwest, I see the green hill with the ruins of the village of Lifta, destroyed in January 1948, and its citizens, almost 3,000 of them, driven out. Out of 450 buildings, only 55 were left standing after attacks by the Haganah. The Israeli army wanted all Palestinians out from the area, entering Jerusalem from the west. Above the hill of Lifta, a huge built-up area of West Jerusalem shows, now called Givat Shaul, the original space of the destroyed village of Deir Yassin, where one of the worst massacres in 1948 happened. 245 people were killed in cold blood. Still further to my right, direction west, I see a huge settlement, Ramot. The first buildings were done in the 70s, 1974, and still in the first 80s, when I did my first visit to Jerusalem, nobody of us expected that the settlement would last, least it would expand. Today, it has almost 50,000 inhabitants. In between, there are huge highways, north-south direction, the Begin Highway, and east-west direction, the highway connecting Jerusalem with Tel Aviv. All of those highways being expanded and enlarged continuously. The latest expansions are that the houses from Ramot are moving down the hill until they have reached the highway, and the same from Ramot Shlomo, moving down from the other side. So Jerusalem obviously is one of the main centers of settler colonialism and ethnic cleansing in Palestine. The reason is quite obvious. Israel wants as big a Jewish majority as possible in the city. Presently, and more or less over the last decades, Palestinians have made up almost 40% of the population in Jerusalem. And just to give you brief numbers, Jerusalem has about 950,000 inhabitants. In East Jerusalem, there are 380,000, almost 400,000 Palestinians, and in the meanwhile, 225,000 Israeli settlers. Jews in the whole city, east and west, make up about 570,000 people. All attempts on the Israeli part to change this have so far, at least, and I have to stress, so far failed. Since the middle of the 90s, Israel started to implement the so-called Center of Life policy. That is, Palestinians had to prove that their center of life was actually in Jerusalem. The result was actually totally counterproductive, because Palestinians who until then had built houses or rented apartments or bought apartments in Aram, north of Beit Hanina, or in Ramallah, all moved back into the city. The well-off people into Shafat, Beit Hanina, Sheikh Jarrah. Many others returned to crowded family homes in the old city, also in family houses in Ras Al Amud and Silwan. Not so well people rented or even bought an apartment in the Shafat refugee camp and in the surroundings of the camp. There, and that's the new story, refugees built huge high-rise buildings for the returning Jerusalemites. And we have a very special case that refugees of 1948 from the village of Beit Thul, 15 kilometers west of Jerusalem, which was destroyed in April 48, and 300 inhabitants all driven out to Jerusalem, first living in the old city, then moved by the Jordanian government and UNRWA to the place where today there is Shafat camp. Sheikh Jarrah and Silwan, and in particular the Batn el-Hawa area of Silwan, have to be seen in this whole context. The occupation tries to get rid of as many Palestinians as possible with whatever means it takes. The Palestinian president, Abu Mazen, who gave a speech last night in front of the Fatah Revolutionary Council meeting, largely overlooked Jerusalem. He stressed the West Bank, Beta, and other villages in the West Bank. He only mentioned in passing Sheikh Jarrah and the fact that some families there are holding out. He forgot Silwan, he forgot the old city, he forgot the Haram, he forgot Bab al-Amud, and of course, he totally forgot Gaza. Gaza obviously only existed for him when we talk about money given to the Palestinians, which he claims in order to rebuild Gaza. So settler colonialism, ethnic cleansing, and of course, the brutal use of violence, not only in Jerusalem, are to be found everywhere in Palestine. And we see, as I try to demonstrate, a historical continuity. As Patrick Wolf has said, settler colonialism is a process, not just an event. And I want to stress now some of the major events where Israel used overwhelming, brutal violence and massacres in order to drive out Palestinians and make place for Jewish immigrants, for Israelis. In 1948, obviously, the central massacre was in the village of Deir Yassin, I mentioned already, with 750 inhabitants. 245 of them were killed. The rest were made refugees, like another 750,000 of Palestinians. The story continued in 1967, and I want to stress here only the example of Emwas, Yalu, and Beit Nuba. 8,000 people were driven out from their old villages, and on the ruins of the villages, the Israelis built a park financed by the government of Canada. The people in 1968 were driven out on the orders of Rabin, and they had to walk in the June heat all the way up to Ramallah. Back in 1948, it was also Rabin who drove out the Palestinians from Elit, and they too were made refugees and had to march all the way to Ramallah in the middle of June. If you read the memoirs of George Habash, you will get a good impression. In between, in 1956, Israel occupied the Gaza Strip for several months. What they did there is they committed one of the worst massacres of the whole history of massacres in Israel. 256 people were murdered in Khan Yunis. These were the first numbers given by UNRWA. Later corrected numbers amount to about 520 people. Salman Abu Sitte lists their names in detail, and the people killed in Khan Yunis were immortalized by Joe Sacco's footnotes in Gaza. Finally, in 1967, Sharon's war in Gaza, among other people, against the Guevara from Gaza, Muhammad el-Aswad. Che Guevara actually visited Gaza in 1959, and again I want to refer to a great report done by Salman Abu Sitte in Middle East Monitor, because Che Guevara admonished the Gazans, don't talk to me about your poverty and about your suffering. Start and build up a resistance movement. Back to the destruction and the massacres in Gaza in 56, thousands of people were driven out and thousands of houses were destroyed. The few examples I mentioned, and time doesn't allow more, the massive amount of violence which was used, had to be used, and is still being used, I have to add, to drive out Palestinians. Now, let me move to the second part of my short paper. As if a regime of settler colonialism the ongoing violence of ethnic cleansing, the whole system of apartheid wasn't enough. The Oslo process led to an additional layer of oppression, the oppression by the Palestinian Authority, the Sultan created through the Oslo process starting in 1993, based this oppression not least on the so-called security cooperation enforced on the Palestinians and respected, accepted, and implemented right from the beginning. And it's ongoing until today, with a very brief interruption during the war on Gaza. President Abbas has repeatedly called the security cooperation as something holy. I want to focus just on one case, the case of Basel el-Araj. Basel el-Araj was a young leftist intellectual who tried to mobilize young people in the West Bank, make them aware of what was going on, make them aware of their history, of the history of resistance, and mobilize them for resistance against the occupation. He was active within the leftist popular Palestinian University, and in particular in the Sulaiman el-Halabi Department of Colonial Studies. Those who don't know Sulaiman el-Halabi, he was an Egyptian resistance fighter who in the 18th century already fought French colonialism. The website is available for those interested. He was jailed by the Sultan in 2016, accused of preparing armed attacks against the occupation. When he was arrested, he was tortured. He finally went on a hunger strike, and this hunger strike, together with immense popular support from the outside, forced the Sultan to release him. But his case was then handed over, or so it seems, to Israeli security services. And together with the Palestinian security services, they searched for him. He had gone underground and located him finally in Kadura refugee camp in El Bire. He was shot dead in an armed attack by the Israeli army. And according to the testimony of Dr. Mustafa Barghouti, there was actually no fight taking place. It was simply a cold-blooded assassination. There are many other outstanding examples for resistance in Palestinian society and all through the occupation. Let me just give very, very briefly a few cases before I focus on one particular case study. The union strikes of the teachers in 2016, not official unions, but a new spontaneous union created by the strikers, which involved almost all teachers from the West Bank. Then a number of cases during the local elections in 2018. For example, the elections in Nablus were a joint Hamas-Fatah list, together with independents, run under the leadership of Adli Yaish from Hamas. Finally, another case from the elections for a village council in the village of Yasuf, where a list of young independent people led by Nashat Abdel Fattah, I'm proudly stating that he was a former student of mine in Birzeit, they established a village council very close to society, sidestepping the attempts by the Sultan to impose their own candidates. My favorite case of resistance bottom-up, however, are the women of the small Bedouin village southeast of Bethlehem, the women of Jubed. Their struggle starts in 2014. They were living in unbearable living conditions, and just remember 2014, that's 7 years ago. They had no running water, no electricity, only a dirt road was leading to the village. There was no primary school after 20 years of the existence of the Sultan, and although the village is located in Area C. The immediate cause for their action was that their children got sick, had lung problems because of the use of petroleum heaters. Also, their children...
3 minutes. 3 minutes, please.
I will make it. The children were humiliated by children in the neighboring villages when they arrived dirty and disheveled in school every morning. In any case, the women went first to the neighboring village to demand electricity and water. Finally, they protested in front of the governor of Bethlehem. They mobilized solidarity and help. They got it from both Palestinian and Israeli NGOs. In the end, one NGO installed solar panels, which were paid for by the Dutch. The Israelis, of course, moved in, and the army removed the solar panels. In this case, the Dutch government under then and present Prime Minister Mark Rutte intervened with Netanyahu, and this was the first case when solar panels were brought back. The success of the women, they were able to establish their own association of Jubed Athib. A primary school was built, the dirt road was paved, they were connected to the private, to the water grid, and they maintained the mobilization for many years. Resistance, as I said, continued all through. I don't have time now to go into this. I want to conclude half a minute only with a few, I think, very important questions. I think we should ask, what can the various forms of Palestinian resistance achieve against the Israeli system of settler colonialism? What about mass struggle like in the Intifadas? First one, 87, second one in 2000. What can armed struggle achieve? Individual attacks, rockets from the Gaza Strip, bottom-up struggle from Palestinian society. Secondly, how can continuity be achieved in all those forms of struggle, and in particular in mass struggle, in holding out? What should be the role of international solidarity? How can it be achieved? And how can it be sustained after it has been achieved since May this year? And finally, what about the role of solidarity from inside Israel, not only in the case of Sheikh Jarrah, where Israeli leftists have been protesting for the last years? I want to end with these important questions. Thanks for your patience, Fadi, and thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much. This is amazing presentation. I just was remembering when I was looking from my home in Hebron and looking at outside, seeing Kiryat Arba settlement, which is a huge settlement in the middle of Hebron, which is controlling a huge land in Hebron. So this is similar to the view where you can see from your home. Yes, indeed, these are very important questions. Maybe we will come to some of them. Thank you very much again. Now we will move to the second presentation. Mr. Mu'in Tahir from Arab Center for Studies. from Jordan. He will be talking about the future of Palestinian national project, exploring the Palestinian options. Please, Mr. Tahir, the floor is yours. Can you please unmute yourself? Mr. Tahir, can you unmute yourself? We cannot listen to you. We cannot hear you. Yes, now.
في إمكانية أشغل الباوربوينت؟ اشتغل؟
Can I share my screen to run the PowerPoint?
Can
Yes,
you give
Taimur,
me
can you help us? Yes.
share option?
يبدو باوربوينت مش شغال.
Seems that my PowerPoint is not working.
ألو 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 سامعيني؟ طيب بقول في إمكانية نشغل الباوربوينت.
Maybe you can go ahead because the time is limited, please, Mr. Tahir.
أعمل شير سكرين ولا مش متاحة هاي؟
Mr. Tahir, can you hear us, right?
ضيع. أوكي. لا بقول لي disabled. إيش شاشتي؟
Okay, he is unable to share his screen.
Taimur, please, can you help us that he will be sharing his PowerPoint? Taimur. Okay, till he will be ready with his PowerPoint, we will go to Mr. Ma'in Rabbani, co-editor from Jadaliyya. He will be talking about the US administration and the question of Palestine. After that, we will come back to Mr. Tahir. Mr. Ma'in
طيب
Rabbani,
على
can
كل
you-
حال واضح إنه
the
مش
floor is
مش ضابط.
Thank you very much. And
حاول
let
أتحدث
me
فيه
also
اليوم.
begin by
هو عبارة عن
thanking the Center
مشروع
for Islam and Global
الوطني.
Study.
I'm sorry, Mr. Fadi, if you can tell, we have both of them speaking together. It seems that Ma'in Tahir is not listening to anybody and not to the interpretation.
I'll stop.
Yes, please. So we will listen to Tahir now. Sorry,
Okay, that's fine.
because the translation there is like. Okay, we are listening now to Tahir.
Listening to who?
To Ma'in al-Tahir.
Okay.
This was from the translator.
Okay, Mr. Ma'in Tahir is not with us, it seems. He's muted and he's not here.
Okay, should we start with, continue with Mr. Rabbani? Okay, I'm sorry. Okay, Ma'in Rabbani, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you.
Okay.
So once again, I'd like to begin by thanking the Center for Islam and Global Affairs for organizing this conference and for inviting me to participate. Given the limited time, I'll try to keep my comments brief, but I've been asked to speak about the US administration and the question of Palestine, and this is primarily a focus on the new US administration and the question of Palestine. And in this respect, I'd like to make several points. The first is that every time a new administration assumes office in Washington, we tend to focus very much on what we think or hope or expect might change. Whereas, in fact, I think we need to pay much closer attention to continuities in US policy. The United States is not a country where the head of state is all powerful and where institutions are very weak, and where every time you have a change of leadership, you can expect any fundamental change of policy. And I think the current administration is a very good example of that. If you look at the most consequential decisions taken by its predecessor, the Trump administration, despite the severe domestic rivalries between the Democrats and the Republicans and all their differences, the Biden administration was clear from the very outset that when it came to issues such as Trump's recognition of Israeli claims of sovereignty over Jerusalem, Trump's recognition of Israeli claims of sovereignty over the occupied Syrian Golan Heights, the movement of the US Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, an explicit violation of Security Council resolution, and a host of other things on the most consequential decisions that were taken by the Trump administration. The Biden administration indicated that there would be no change. On the less consequential issues, such as U.S. funding for the United Nations Refugee and Works Agency, opening a U.S. consulate in East Jerusalem so that the United States is in a better position to communicate the Israeli agenda to the Palestinians on issues such as reopening a Palestinian diplomatic mission in Washington and so on. There we will see change, but not on the things that really matter that have happened. Now, if we go back, I believe it was Lyndon Johnson in 1968 who was the first president to be described upon his departure from office as the best friend Israel ever had in Washington. And what we've seen is that every subsequent US president has entirely accurately been described the same way. And from what we've seen so far, I don't think there's any reason to assume that it will be any different with Joe Biden. Now, a few things about the new administration. It came into office making quite clear it didn't want to have to deal with the question of Palestine. It had a number of severe domestic crises. In foreign affairs, it was primarily concerned with the relationship with Iran as far as the Middle East is concerned, and the relationship with China, and to a lesser extent, Russia globally, reestablishing relations with its European allies and so on. And it didn't want to have to deal with this. But in the end, it didn't have a choice because it was essentially sucked into the equation by Israeli policy. First, by Israel's actions in Jerusalem and Sheikh Jarrah and at the Haram al-Sharif and the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And then, more importantly, by the severe incompetence of the Israeli military and intelligence services in meeting their objectives in the Gaza Strip. So you had a situation where the United States was primarily preoccupied with giving Israel more time to achieve its objectives, the Israelis consistently failing to achieve their objectives, so that by the end, the Biden administration had stuck out its neck so far in order to defend Israel, that you had Europeans saying, we thought there was going to be a change in Washington, but what we're really seeing, for example, in the Security Council is exactly the same, where you had the United States on 3 consecutive occasions blocking the Security Council, not from issuing a resolution condemning Israel, but from issuing a press statement that merely expressed, an anodyne concern about the slaughter that was taking place. So the other point I would like to make is that we need to more clearly focus on the United States, not as a country that is supporting Israel, but as a state that is itself also a party to the conflict. That's, I think, how we need to understand the U.S. role in order to properly evaluate it. So, for example, before the conflict was even out, it turned out that the Biden administration had issued instructions to sell, I believe it was $735 million worth of new armaments and precision munitions and so on to Israel. The second the cessation of hostilities was declared, the Biden administration rushed to announce that it would replenish Israel's supply of missiles for its apparently not very effective Iron Dome missile defense system and so on. And there's, a whole series of actions that within the space of just 10 days in May made very clear that the United States is not an external party that is throwing its weight behind one of the parties in the Middle East, but is itself also a participant in this conflict. And it does so primarily by working in order to ensure continued Israeli impunity and to ensure that Israel will not face any accountability for its actions in its dealings with the Palestinian people. Secondly, when we look at the United States, we tend to focus very much on the White House and the individual who at that point is the President of the United States. We need to look at it, I think, much more broadly. For example, the role of Congress is crucial in not only formulating United States policy, but also in restraining the ability of the executive to act. There's a constant slew of legislation emanating from Congress, either pro-Israeli or anti-Palestinian, that can have real consequences. So, for example, the U.S. The movement of the embassy to Jerusalem, or branding the PLO as a terrorist organization. These emanate from congressional legislation that goes back to the 1980s and 1990s. There is now, I think, an important difference, which is that you're beginning to see the development of a progressive constituency within the Democratic Party that is perhaps for the first time in decades genuinely critical, not only of Israel, but even more importantly, of the U.S. role in supporting and enabling Israel. So we've had, for example, initiatives by a number of Congress people to seek to either limit U.S. military aid to Israel or to ensure that U.S. military aid to Israel conforms to U.S. restrictions on how it can be used, or to go even further. And this is not legislation that is going to pass, but I think it's an important indicator of where things could be happening, could be heading, if these opportunities are properly utilized. So Finally, I'd like to look at both the opportunities and the risks in the period coming forward. Now, I think one important opportunity along the lines of what I was just discussing is that with this administration in power, and forget for a moment, that Biden is a self-declared Zionist and all the rest of it. What is important here is that the pressure on this White House is not coming from the neocons and the far right and the Christian evangelicals and so on, as was the case with the Trump administration. Here, the main pressure on the White House is coming from progressive constituencies. And I think that does create opportunities to influence US policy and to limit the damage that US policy can inflict on the Palestinians. A second opportunity, and this is one that I think is more long-term, is that one thing that Trump and Netanyahu have succeeded in achieving is fracturing the solid bipartisan consensus in favor of more or less unconditional US support of Israel, which was Israel's primary strategic asset for the past several decades. When Israel becomes an increasingly partisan issue in American politics, which it increasingly is becoming, that creates genuine opportunities for Palestinians and their supporters to have an impact on US policy, particularly when the party that is less identified with Israel is in power in the White House. A third, and I would say, of course, the most important opportunity comes from changes on the ground. Change is never going to come from Washington unless and until it is in response to change that is happening on the ground in Palestine. And in this respect, I think that what we saw in May was extremely encouraging. Now, just to recall, in February, you had Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, writing an article in the Wall Street Journal, basically referring to the Arab-Israeli conflict in the past tense, something that, he had managed to resolve with his brokered agreements between Israel and a number of Arab states. And then he was very dismissive of the Palestine question as, a real estate dispute that he and Netanyahu had basically managed to resolve by pretending it doesn't exist. Well, 1 week into the latest Israeli rampage in the Gaza Strip, and you had the most senior US military officer, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Mark Milley, I think his name is, basically saying that a continuation of the situation in the Gaza Strip was having consequences that could threaten US interests in the region. I mean, that's a sea change in the space of less than 120 days. And I think we need to be aware of these kinds of things and to understand that changes in Washington are above all going to be responses to changes on the ground in Palestine and the region, as a result of which the US begins to feel that its interests are less secure than they are under the status quo. And lastly, I think another opportunity is, of course, the changing conversation where you now have mainstream establishment human rights organizations like Human Rights Watch openly speaking about Israeli apartheid, not only referring to the West Bank, but to the whole of Palestine. And, it's not a question about whether the report is right or wrong and why they waited until 2021, but this has to be seen in the context of the systematic assault on advocacy for Palestinian rights in the United States, the attempt to delegitimize and to criminalize it, and the space this creates, once again, to have serious discussion and debate about Israeli practices and Palestinian rights in the U.S. Context. I think I have 2 or 3 minutes left. So finally, I'll just very briefly enumerate the risks. The main risk, of course, is a continuation of the status quo, what I would call the status quo of continuous dispossession, because there is no status quo in the sense of something that's frozen in time, but it's constantly changing. And left to itself, I believe it's changing to the Palestinian disadvantage, unless and until Palestinians act as they did in a united fashion in May to try to change it. A second risk is the new Israeli government. Not so much the government itself. It's a much weaker government than the outgoing one. But as you know, there was enormous misgivings and even hostility towards Netanyahu, particularly within the Biden administration. This was primarily a personal issue with him because of his closeness to Trump. And even though the new prime minister is more of an extremist than even Netanyahu was, I think there's a risk that there's so much relief at the changing of the guard at the Israeli leadership that he will be given space and indulgence that wouldn't be extended to the old government. And finally, of course, what I was alluding to previously, which is the ongoing delegitimization and attempts at the outright criminalization of Palestinian advocacy in the United States, particularly using the spurious charge of anti-Semitism, where any criticism of Israel is now being denounced as anti-Semitism. We see this a lot in Europe as well, but it's also happening in the United States. And the point I always make is, if one looks at how anti-Semitism has been redefined from a hatred of Jews to opposition to Israel and its policies, we see that the fastest growing population of anti-Semites in the United States are actually non or anti-Zionist Jews. So on that point, I just like to conclude by saying, don't only focus at the pinnacle of power, but look at the entire pyramid. Because there's a lot that is in either shorter or long-term flux, and that provides genuine opportunities if Palestinians and their supporters rise to meet the challenge, organize properly, and do what they can to seek to influence US policy. But at the same time, change will originate from within the region and be affected in the United States rather than the other way around. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this great presentation. And now we will move to Mr. Muayin. Mr. Muayin, are you ready to speak? It seems to be there is a problem.
نعم نعم.
Okay.
لا نعم أنا جاهز الآن.
Yes, I'm ready now.
Okay, go ahead.
And I can start. Okay, then the subject of my presentation is about the National Palestinian Project and trying to look into or have a future outlook or a future vision. There are assumptions on which this paper is based in trying to look into the future based on past experiences and lessons learned and understanding the nature of the Zionist and settler colonial movement with their Torah-based vision of Palestine. On the other hand, Palestinians are steadfast with their vision, and they have learned that semi-solutions would not give just solution to the Palestinian cause. All of Palestinian territories, as we know, are under Zionist occupation, part of which was occupied in 1948 and the rest in 1965. Half the Palestinian people are under occupation in different ways, and the other half has been displaced and deported outside their territories. The national project of this Palestinian people is that which sticks to the unity of the territory, the people, and the cause. It is one that provides for all of Palestine, all of its territory, all of its narrative, and provides various types of struggles. And in the struggle against occupation and Zionist hegemony, part of the Palestinian people lived on part of the Palestinian territory, but the Zionists did not abide by the Oslo Agreement, and the agreement and the accords did not give them any deadline to change the status quo, and the status quo has been in place for more than 30 years. So Israel now occupies more than 80% of the Palestinian territories in the West Bank, and Palestinian territories have been fragmented into separate compartmentalized areas with also settlement expansion. The re-establishment of the idea of a Palestinian state has always been the obsession of Palestinian leadership since as early as the establishment of the Zionist entity itself. But after the failure of the Grand Palestine government in establishing a Palestinian entity, the idea of a Palestinian entity became an immaterial moral idea that symbolizes their cause and their hope of liberating their land. And that's why they started to look at their cause as an Arab cause, and they became part of all coups and revolutions in the 50s and the first half of the 60s in the Arab world. After the establishment of the PLO, the PLO adopted the idea of a democracy in which the three religions coexist. However, after the October War in 1973, the idea of an international peace conference in Geneva was proposed, and Anwar al-Sadat proposed to the Palestinian leadership the idea of talking about the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, that is the 1967 Palestinian territories, and whether they would belong to and be annexed to Jordan or to the PLO. And the PLO responded to that proposal, abandoning practically the idea of liberating all historical Palestine. And it was clear that what in Rabat, in the Rabat summit, the PLO was recognized as the sole and legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. There was an interim solution, which is the establishment of a Palestinian authority on part of Palestine, and Mr. Kissinger and the Israelis considered it a conflicted territory, and it was followed by disagreements between the PLO and Jordan and the PLO and Syria at different points. afterwards, the Palestinian resistance was dealt with the stick and carrot policy as the PLO engaged in battles to defend its very existence, but was also pulled into some concessions in order to acknowledge the 242 resolution, which meant that the national charter was considered revoked, reaching up to the Oslo Accord. However, ultimately, the Zionists never intended to withdraw from Palestinian territories because they believe that Palestine, from the sea to the river, is a Jewish country and Jewish land. And the two-state solution was based on the end of the settlement, but Mahmoud Abbas allied with the Israeli authorities. The project of the two-state solution was illusory, and the international community always tried to maintain the status quo, protecting the situation from exploding while promising always with the future negotiating and providing economic assistance. The issue of a two-state solution is no longer seriously on the table, and everyone knows that it's not. And international organizations like Human Rights Watch and Carnegie have explicitly called for a change of the political path into a path that's related to rights and justice. On the other hand, the PLO still talks about uses the rhetoric of a two-state solution, although it has no viability. Due to the failure of this two-state solution, the one-state solution was proposed, which the PLO has previously already proposed as a democracy in which the three religions coexist. The one-state project means a one-state on the land of historical Palestine, where all of its citizens are equal and the right of return is recognized, while acknowledging national rights for the Jewish people, although they're not a national group in the first place. People who propose this idea believe that it is a human and just solution to the situation in Palestine while addressing the problem of the Jewish people, and it's addressed it through the equality of citizenship or a dual national state, and all of these are visions of a one state used to in the face of the Zionist and dominant Israel. However, Israel did not accept even that, and they did not accept the establishment of Palestinian an unarmed Palestinian state on 22% of historical Palestine. So how would they accept establishing one state on all of historical Palestine that controls all of Palestine? On the other hand, Israel controls Palestine, deports its people, and expose its people to siege, arrest, and other practices under its Zionist apartheid regime. This regime is unique, and it's not identical to the South African apartheid or racial segregation, because in the Palestinian case, it is aimed primarily at totally displacing and deporting the Palestinian people to replace them with the Jewish people. So it goes beyond the racial paradigm to settler colonialism. The apartheid regime on Palestinians in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip is also applied to the 1948 Palestinians who were deported after Al-Nakba, who are also subject to racial segregation and apartheid, and it also applies to Palestinians outside Palestine because they are prevented from returning to Palestine. The Zionist apartheid is the central framework of Palestinian struggle. In the recent Jerusalem battle, it became clear how this problematic issue could be addressed. Previously, there were some disagreements around this. Some people believe that we need to go back to the armed conflict and armed struggle, and others are calling for popular demobilization and popular intifada, and others believe that the resistance in Gaza can provide for point of departure which can develop one day to solve the issue. But in all of those proposals, it failed short from really solving the issue. But the recent battle in Jerusalem, we saw that the resistance came out of Gaza from its Gaza borders and became nationwide. And the battles in Gaza were no longer about breaking the siege, but about Jerusalem and hostilities by the settlers. The West Bank was also was in an uprising from end to end, and the greatest surprise was the 48 Palestinians who took to the streets in rejection of the apartheid regime and in support of Jerusalem. The Jerusalem battle proved that new and different struggle methods may be used while recognizing the peculiarity of each Palestinian community and the kind of a front line they stand at, and that we need political institutions that would lead those multifaceted resistance front lines, which requires revisiting to the structure of the PLO. The PLO, after being revived by the Palestinian people, should undertake a new mission and be revived from the dead. And that's why we may find as Palestinian communities and factions faced with the necessity to convene in a conference to agree on a new national council that provides the leadership. This could be through the unification of all Palestinians abroad and by activating the Arab follow-up committee in Palestine and electing members to the National Council alongside some popular activities in order to pressure the PLO to become a truly representative leadership. As for the Palestinian Authority, after its leadership stopped its security coordination and stopped its recognition of Israel and talked about abolishing the Oslo Accords, they quickly went back and withdrew those declarations under vain pretexts. The Palestinian Authority needs to change its function and transform itself, and because it has become and fallen hostage to the occupation, and now it's in its late days that in a phase that may end with the departure of Abbas from power. And the authority, the Palestinian Authority, may have become the authority over separate cantons governed by the Israeli military and it's not unlikely that it would report directly to as an Israeli security officer. The struggle against the apartheid is not about providing a transient or interim solutions, but about the accumulation of various forms of the struggles according to the peculiarity of the different front lines on which Palestinians stand, and the idea of expelling the occupier may be a substitute to the one or two state solution. We should notice that recently international interaction with the Palestinian cause have developed greatly, and since the USQA report in 2017, international reports calling the Israeli regime as apartheid, which is considered an international crime against humanity, have increased, and the movements of boycotting this regime in the West, and particularly among the youth and academics, have grown greatly, and this gives us hope that there is a growing international movement that may isolate Israel on the level of the Arab world. The battle against Zionism is part and parcel of the Arab Spring, which shall continue and prevail, all despite the fact that some governments may seek alliance with Israel while trying to take the Arab world back to the colonial era. However, there is also the role of the Jews who are anti-Zionism. This call is for those powers and forces who are pro-democracy. Are they ready in engaging in a joint battle against the Israeli apartheid regime? And this is related to the isolation of this Zionist regime. And finally, does struggle against the apartheid have to offer a final solution? Actually, the Zionist apartheid would not end unless the Zionist regime itself is dismantled and justice is provided for the whole of the Palestinian people, including the right of return, while the final solution would be determined by the ultimate result of this struggle. And it's not only about the Palestinian people, but also the position of the Jews who live in Palestine. There are two models in modern history. In South Africa, where the whites decided to stay under the state, and the Algeria model, where most French settlers decided to go back to France rather than stay in the Algerian state. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much. This is really a very important presentation. Thank you very much. Now we will move to the last presentation, which is entitled Normalization and Resistance in the Arab and Muslim Context. Dr. Talawi, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Dear colleagues and friends, good evening. Let me start by thanking Dr. Sami Al-Aryan and CIGA for giving me the chance.
You need to be in the English channel, please.
Okay.
We cannot hear you, Mr.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, yes.
Dear colleagues and friends, good evening. Let me start by thanking Professor Sami Al-Aryan and CIGA for giving me the chance to share with you my views on normalization and resistance in Arab and Muslim context. The Arab region recently witnessed a rush towards normalization with Israeli occupation. Some saw this Some saw what is happening as a Palestinian crisis, but in fact, it is a subjective crisis related to the system of governance in the Arab and Islamic world in general. And the countries which normalized with the occupation in particular, the essence of which is the dichotomy between the public and the government and the lack of popular support for those governments. Most probably the term normalization in the Arab context first appeared after Egypt signed a peace treaty with Israel in 1979. The civil society and the majority of the Egyptian people refused the agreement, but could not foil it because it was under military rule. So they decided not to interact with the Israeli occupation, especially at the cultural level, which became known as the anti-normalization movement. Of course, other Arab intellectuals joined the movement, especially after Jordan signed its own agreement with the Israeli occupation. All opinion polls conducted in the Arab world showed the opposition of the majority of the Arab people, sometimes 90% of the people, to establish any kind of relations with the occupation, as well as establishing full diplomatic relations with it. Therefore, when government normalized with Israel while about 90% of the people rejected, this means that the government operates without popular legitimacy, which reflects an internal crisis linked to the way the Arab and Islamic regimes are built. Those regimes justify normalization under the pretext of achieving political and economic interests. And we saw in more than one historical turning point, whether in the agreement signed by Egypt in 1979 or Jordan in 1994 to normalize the relation with Israel occupation, that it was preceded by a huge media campaign that promoted that economic conditions would improve and that the citizens in general would see an economic improvement. But after decades of signing them, we did not find any credibility for these promises. This leads us to the conclusion that these agreements in general serve an elite controlling the decision who needs foreign authorization to remain in power and solve its limited self problems. And it is unfortunate and sad that the Gulf crisis, for example, arose by an American decision and no Arab or Islamic mediation succeeded in resolving it. So American mediation came to resolve the quarrel between siblings. This applies also to the Moroccan case, as Morocco claims its entitlement to the Western Sahara, and there is a war going on over this entitlement. And instead of warring parties heading to a kind of reconciliation and understanding, considering that they are the people of this land and the geography, they needed a foreign mandate to resolve their problems. Then the government claims that this foreign intervention is a kind of victory. The solution to the overwhelming Arab and Muslim internal crisis lies in the people having the freedom to choose their representatives and to restore the national decision and national dignity through an agenda that expresses the will of the people, where the people are the source of all powers. At that time, all situations will change, the handling of various issues will change, and national issues will become a priority on top of which is the central issue, as it is called in the Arab world, the central issue of the Arab and Islamic nation, the Palestinian cause. This was reinforced by the fact that we have noticed that countries that enjoyed some degree of political freedom and democracy have a great immunity against normalization compared to countries that do not live in democracy and formal elections. And we have noticed that democratic countries have the liability to face American-Israeli pressures to enter normalization race. There is also an important point to read in this current scene from an Arab nationalist view, which is that the aim of Balfour Declaration and establishment of the Israeli occupation state at the beginning of the 20th century was to tear the Arab and Islamic world apart and prevent it from exercising any leadership role at the international level and to dismember it. And it was not just a scheme targeting Palestinian territories and Palestinian people only. If we look at trade exchanges, for example, between Arab countries, we will find them almost non-existent and formally worthless amid the spread of border disputes, and they are the product of colonial inheritance that wanted to shape this scene in the region. Our peoples need a profound change in culture, and our main problem is that we have not been able to build a political system that expresses the people's national will. The concern of many Arabs with their personal desires and considering themselves without a real human value, mission, or role has resulted in a person who lacks dignity. We frequently see restrictions and insults to Arab passport holders everywhere, and this is reinforced by the fact that the ruling elite serves its interests and wants the people only to eat and drink and not to interfere in public life or ask questions about how the country is governed. Today, the elites in the Arab and Islamic countries are clearly required to see a way out of this situation and to use all methods, movement, and sacrifice to extract freedom. Without freedom, we will not obtain a project or a national or personal dignity or rights in major issues, especially Palestinian cause. Although these elites have their religious ideology and ethnicity differences, they should cooperate with each other in pursuit of freedom and an independent national project that is far from foreign domination. If it happens, this will serve the issue of Palestine and Jerusalem. After every normalization agreement, some come to us with the logic that normalization agreement have become a fait accompli, and it must be dealt with it on this basis and work within the framework of their existence. This is undoubtedly a false logic, and if it was true, there would not be any corrective movement at the level of human history. The justification today is that this normalization is in the interest of the Palestinian people and Jerusalem, and that this act of utmost patriotism is a fierce justification. Perhaps we did not hear the opinion of Al-Quds Committee in Morocco regarding normalization because of this justification, although we blame it for that, of course, but What about the Arab League and the OIC and maybe the GCC as well? What about all these frameworks and institutions that did not solve any problem yet? Unfortunately, they were the cause of division and conflict. Since its creation in 1945, the Arab League has always been a house divided between different camps, alliances, and loyalties. The Palestinian cause, however, was perhaps the most unifying topic for all its members. The unwavering support for the Palestinian people, at least rhetorical support, was always been reiterated at the outset of every Arab and Muslim summit until it became almost a routinely protocol for the League's member, but perhaps not anymore. As for the Palestinians, Palestinian Authority, it is, in my opinion, merely another Arab regime. It lacks a patriotic agenda. It organizes reconciliation meetings, but when the time comes to pay the price, everything turns into a mirage. It seems that the PA believes that rights are taken by begging, not by resistance. And this is a firm and clear humanitarian role. Outside the Palestinian Authority, the Palestinians in the diaspora play an active role as much as possible in the countries where there is a space for freedom. But in the Arab countries, the Arab regimes, unfortunately, do not allow Palestinians to express their national identity or a national project or any kind of resistance by confronting normalization, because there is no freedom for the people of the region. So what about the Palestinians who are considered merely refugees? The conclusion is that the absence of freedom is a cause of normalization. If freedom is found, the national Arab and Islamic interest, including Palestine, will be a priority. If we want to summarize what we have said in the talk, it will be based on 10 important points or so. First, normalization dictates a leading Western entity in the region. It kills Arab solidarity because there are Arab countries that are not yet liberated. It contributes to the suppression of democracy in the region because democratic movements that express the will of the people reject occupation and normalization and contradict the formal position. And normalization is a threat to the people of the region because it perpetuates economic underdevelopment by creating external dependence. It is in Israel's interest not to allow a regional competitor to emerge because it contradicts with its vision and role. The absence of democracy and external dependence perpetuates tyranny and corruption that cannot produce development and stability. Normalization will destabilize the region and encourage extremism and terrorism because it is it's the only available expression in the absence of political expression. Normalization will not achieve national interest, rather it will serve the personal interest of the elites and decision makers. Solving Arab problems and Arab interests are related to the rapprochement of Arab countries and not a grant from abroad. Normalization will dictate the Arab region as a fragile region and easy to invade. Normalization will perpetuate the occupation of the Holy Land and provide it with grounds for economic power and legitimacy. It will weaken the Palestinian opposition and immorally besiege them. We must emphasize that the popular level is completely separate from the governmental level of the normalization of the normalizing country, although the official although the official side has reached advanced stages of normalization in some Arab countries, and observers continuous communication between Arab officials and their Israeli counterparts, the popular side seems to be completely separate from what is happening on the official side and treats normalization with Israel as a reprehensible thing in all Arab countries. This is something that should be taken advantage of. The intellectuals have responsibility to stop the cultural normalization with the occupation and not to grant legitimacy to the doubtful formal Arab position. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Balawi. I got really a lot of a question. Let's start with Professor Baumgarten. I know that you wrote an article in 2005 protecting that Hamas will win if there will be election in Palestine, and 2006, 1 year later, Hamas win that election. So if we will have now election in Palestine, how you will assess that, since we are talking about the future of the Palestinian struggle? The second question, you lived almost 3 decades in Jerusalem and you are teaching political science, you are engaged in academia in the center of Palestine in Birzeit University. So after this last event on Gaza and Sheikh Jarrah and Jerusalem, how do you assess the situation? Because as a Palestinian, now we are witnessing people having more perspective about the future, having more hope, looking at the future than before. And I am today more optimistic about the future than ever. So how you would comment on this? To Mr. Rabbani, you talked about America, and this is a very important contribution. How do you think we are witnessing now more people supporting Palestine in America? So do you think that will affect the American foreign policy toward Palestine? And also, maybe you know, I'm sure you know, Peter Ben Art, he wrote a book long years ago saying the crisis of Zionism, trying to say in the future, we will have a new young generation, Jewish young generation, they will distance from Israel because of its apartheid policy, settlement, aggression, whatever. So do you think if we will have a kind of shift in the Jewish community in the US as an important great power, that will impact somehow the situation in Palestine? And also you talked about the change on the ground. One more question is also, do you think if we will have like a kind of a unity, like a kind of government formulated by Hamas and Fatah, that will make some positive impact on how America deal with the Palestinian case? To Mr. Tahir, you talked about rebuilding BLO. So how could this happen? Especially we have Mahmoud Abbas. He is dominating and controlling very well the whole of the BA, as well as the Palestinian Liberation Organization. So how can we rebuild BLO if Abbas is controlling everything and he's not allowing even a different voice within Fatah movement to speak? And we know this, for example, in the last months, people from Fatah are dismissed because they are disagreeing with his policy. So yeah, so this is a kind of question I would like to know, how we can rebuild the BLO. Also, one question more. You talk about moving or changing the Palestinian Authority from like a kind of Palestinian authority that engaged with politics to more a kind of service like khadamatiya, right? So how could this happen? How Israel will allow this? Now I got also several questions from the people following us through social media. Let me go one by one. One to Professor Helga. How has Palestinian politics changed, if any, after the latest confrontation in Gaza? And why do you think it's difficult to mobilize the Palestinian in West Bank for a new intifada? I remember in 2013, we talked about this. You talk about how the Palestinian feel they have two enemies, the Palestinian Authority as well as the Israeli. So that why hindering a new intifada to come. And also we would like to listen to you. What do you think about this? Another question also for Professor Baumgarten. How do you assess the prospect of the so-called two-state solution? And if it's over, what would be an alternative in your opinion? One question also from the internet to Mr. Rabbani. How do the political elite think the end of the conflict would like in the light of the end of the two-state solution? Are they ready to deal with apartheid Israel? And if not, what are their options?
Sorry, which political elite?
Yeah, so the political elite, how they will deal with the
US political elite or the Palestinian?
Yes, US political elite. To Mr. Tahir, can the Palestinians around the world mobilize themselves politically despite the Palestinian Authority? In other words, can they revive the BLO without the cooperation of Fatah and Mahmoud Abbas? This is almost the same question as the one I asked. To Al-Tahiri also one question more related, how do you assess the political performance of the main Palestinian factions? How do we unite Palestinian on central issues? Now also we have several questions for Dr. Balawi about the normalization. First of all, how do we define normalization? Aren't people who normalize with normalizer also normalizers themselves? Another question also from the internet, from people following us, to Balawi, how do we deal with the normalizer as a group, movement, and individual? So how we react to the normalization, how we react on the individual, collective, NGOs, governmental level. Also one question to Dr. Balawi, do you believe that the visit of the leader of Hamas, Ismail Haniyeh, to a country that normalizing with Israel, this is something will harm the Palestinian case, because he was going to Morocco, for example, and we are knowing, we know what Morocco is doing with Israel. So do you think, this question coming from the internet, do you think this is affecting negatively the Palestinian case? Yeah, so far, this is some of the question I get. I will give now each of you like 7 minutes or 5 minutes, let's say 5 minutes. Maybe you can comment on some of these questions. Thank you very much. We will start with Dr. Helga.
Okay, well, first of all, the question of elections. I mean, you all know that Mahmoud Abbas has decided not to hold elections, and I think the present situation will certainly reinforce this attitude very much. His popularity has gone down tremendously. I mean, popularity of Fatah and of Abbas has never been so low than right now, so I do not see any chance for elections at all. He will not hold them. The second question, and here I'm relating again to my presentation, we do have in the West Bank supporting the rule of the Sultan a very strong security service. It's the strongest part in the whole government. Most people working there are in the security services. They get most of the budget of the Sultan, and they are actually supporting the government and controlling the population. So in a situation like this, it's very, very hard to find space to move and change things. Now, what we do have is a tremendous popular mobilization. However, we should not overlook that this mobilization was the lowest in the West Bank. It was much, much higher in Jerusalem. It was much, much higher inside Israel among the Palestinians in Israel. It was the lowest because of the control of the Sultan and the security services. Still, you know, there is a collision going on, and the tremendous support for change, I think, is challenging the Sultan. We have had, for example, just yesterday, the arrest of another activist in Hebron. You should perhaps know him, Isa Amru. He was arrested, held overnight, will have to present himself again in front of the Sultan because he accused the Sultan and said, why do you arrest people from the opposition? Better arrest all the corrupt people inside the Sultan. So there is an ongoing struggle, but I think with the tremendous support Abbas is now getting from the outside, from the United States, from the Europeans, with all the money coming in, money they prevent from reaching the Gaza Strip and Hamas, things will be very, very difficult. And I mean, what we can hope for is the continuation of mobilization and the pressure, the outside pressure of mobilized Palestinians, be it from Jerusalem, from inside Israel, from Europe and the United States, and hopefully also from the Gaza Strip, so that the people in the West Bank can also move, not only on Facebook or Instagram and so on, YouTube, but also in real life. But it will be a very, very tough struggle. We should not underestimate Mahmoud Abbas. I have done that, I have to say, self-critically in the past. His strong security service, which so far has not shown any sign of leaving the Sultan.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yes, I was asked the two-state solution.
Yes, please.
If we take the latest poll by Khalil Shikaki, the support for a one-state solution is very, very, very low. The support for the two-state solution is, comparatively speaking, much higher, but also very low. People do not expect that either this or that will come about, but support for the two-state solution is definitely much, much stronger. At the same time, we do have people, intellectuals, elite, oppositional elite, who are arguing there is no chance for a two-state solution. And the question is, how do we engage in this new situation, and in which direction do we want to move politically?
Yeah, the two-state solution. I remember Ilan Bappe, he's saying in one of his books, the two-state solution is like a dead body in the morgue. So Israel is always using it when there is a need for that. Okay, thank you very much. The floor is yours now, Mr. Rabban.
Thank you. 4 questions. The first concerns the U.S. public, and I think it's fair to say there has been a shift in US public opinion. If you compare the latest Israeli assault on the Gaza Strip with the previous one in 2014, this one was much shorter, caused significantly less death and destruction. Israel was confronted arguably with more effective resistance than in 2014. Nevertheless, US public opinion seemed to be much more animated by support and solidarity with the Palestinians in 2021 than it was in 2014. I think the key question is the extent to which this movement will be organized and sustained. In other words, that it's not just a transient response of outrage to something that has happened, but turns into a significant movement. And unless it does so, I don't think it will have an opportunity to exercise a meaningful impact on US decision making. And the second factor is that, as we saw in 2014, and indeed any other time, there's an upsurge of support and solidarity with the Palestinians, we will now see a very systematic and severe backlash that seeks to deflect, delegitimize, and criminalize such expressions of support, using once again the canard of anti-Semitism and trying to equate opposition to Israel or its practices or its policies as anti-Semitism. And I think people need to not only be prepared for this backlash, but to be prepared to confront it as basically an irrelevancy, because what we're seeing is that anti-Semitism is being redefined from an expression of racism against Jews to opposition to Israel and its policies, and that needs to be understood. Second question, you referred to Peter Beinart's book on the crisis of Zionism and American Jews. Well, a year before he published his book, Norman Finkelstein published Knowing Too Much, and I think the title summarizes it quite well. The American Jewish community on the whole tends to be quite liberal, and that is even more true for American Jewish youth. And I think Israel has made it impossible for them, as I think Finkelstein explains very well, has made it impossible for them to, on the one hand, embrace these liberal principles and at the same time embrace Israel. And that, I think, is the real crisis. And as even a growing number of Israeli analysts and correspondents are pointing out, the problem is not that Israeli propaganda is getting less effective. The problem is that Israeli reality is getting better communicated and more effective, if you will. Third question about the unity, about a potential Palestinian unity government. There isn't going to be one. At least as long as Mahmoud Abbas remains in office. Prior to his, I've for years maintained that his removal is not the solution, but no solution can be implemented prior to his removal. And I think that is as true today as it's ever been. I don't think that will have any impact on US policy. For example, if you look at the US position during the past month, they've been very clear that the US objective is to basically bolster and strengthen the Palestinian Authority and to ensure that it is not weakened at the expense of particularly Hamas and Islamic Jihad. U.S. policy in this respect is unchanged, and it's not going to respond positively to Palestinian national unity. And therefore, I don't think the U.S. attitude or response should in any way be a factor in any decisions Palestinians make about their political future, because Palestinian interests are not going to be on the US agenda unless the Palestinians, and hopefully along with others in the Middle East, make it more costly for the US to ignore Palestinian interests than to take them into consideration. Now, the last question is how the US political elite is responding to what is termed the demise of the two-state solution. Well, I think as Mu'ayn Taher explained, Israel and the US were never serious about the two-state solution. And I think the two-state solution in American and Israeli terms is best understood not as a political framework for future relations with the Palestinians, but as a fig leaf that exists to legitimize expanded colonization on the ground, on the one hand, and as a fig leaf that serves as a justification for continued uncritical, unconditional U.S. Support for Israel on the other. So yes, they would like to maintain the framework, because in its absence, I think people, rather than looking at negotiations and diplomacy and all the rest of it, will start paying more attention to the reality on the ground. But I think it's important to emphasize that for the U.S. and Israel, establishing implementing a two-state settlement, even I think as Mu'ayn was saying, what do you call it, demilitarized Palestinian state lacking meaningful sovereignty, even that was not something they were prepared to seriously consider.
Okay. Thank you very much. This is very clear. To Tahir, please. Now to Mu'ayn.
شكرا أظن أن الموضوع
Thank you indeed. I think that the issue of the PLO and the authority, the Palestinian Authority, are interlinked. I believe the results of the recent Sword of Jerusalem plunged or interjected the new bloods in the dried out Palestinian veins after the meeting of the Europeans and the Americans with Mahmoud Abbas. But I believe this will not be sufficient to revitalize the Palestinian Authority in general. The Palestinian Authority became larger than the PLO, and the authority with its security coordination, its policy is very clear. And even the recent report of a Human Rights Watch and in the recommendations to the Palestinian Authority, they demanded the Palestinian Authority to stop the security coordination because this is considered a support to the Israeli colonial, Israeli apartheid system. We have an authority that is established for the Palestinians, and this authority is providing some services as humble as they are, like opening roads, providing some health services, education services, some administrative issues. But in reality, it is a proxy for the occupation, because basically the Palestinian people is under occupation and these are the responsibility of the occupation. However, we have institutions that were established under this authority. In the past, when we were asking about, or when the questions were asked about the future of the authority, some people used to say or to demand dismantling the authority. But I am one of the people to demand to shift the function of the authority to become an authority of services, including policing services. Maybe this will face the opposition of the Israeli occupation. So if there is someone who is brave enough to demand that, they should consider that as part of the struggle and bear all the costs, whether intimidation or arrest. But I believe that it is important to isolate the authority, and this can be done only through uh, amplifying the resistance against the occupation, because we don't want to get into a Palestinian conflict. But the more opposition and the more resistance to the there is against the Israelis, the weaker the authority will become. And in addition to that, the municipality elections is very important factor. Before, a lot of these services were provided by the municipalities for the Palestinian people. That's what I expect, and I don't think that after the after the departure of Mahmoud Abbas, to one reason or another, I believe that another officer will take control of the authority, and it will become an authority of cantons in Palestine. We need to realize some facts. First, the National Palestinian Council, for example, is supposed to hold a meeting, one meeting a year. Actually, Ahmed al-Shuqiri established this organization, and even in the 80s, when this conference was held in Algeria, from 20 in 27 years 20 conferences were held, but since Oslo until today, within 30 years, three conferences only were held, and one of them didn't have the quorum. And the second conference was just to abolish the charter, and the third meeting, which was held, if we consider them correct or legal, so they were only three in 30 years. In terms of the Palestinian factions, in 2011 they decided, when they met in Cairo, to have one national framework, but it has never been mentioned again. Now, what Muhammad Abbas is suggesting is a national a consensus government, but it will not be a consensus government, because we see the quartet and the veto that was put against Hamas after they won the elections, which led to the Palestinian division. So the Palestinians and abroad tried, along with the Palestinians inside, to make any initiative, but whenever they do that, they were always accused to be, they want to go beyond the Palestinian Liberation Organization, and this is an intimidation that need to stop. Unless the framework of the national leadership, or the joint leadership, and the revitalizing the PLO, I believe the Palestinian communities abroad and Palestinians of the territories of 1948 should create a founding Congress, similar to the founding Congress, or when the PLO was established in its first meeting in Jerusalem in 1964. But I don't see any other way to elect or select a new leadership for the Palestinian people. The last question was about evaluating the factions. I think that most of the factions are not present on the ground, and they are established by Mahmoud Abbas. If we see at the members of the central authority, the central branch, they are. We have two members from the Iraqi front, for example. If we get all the members of the Iraqi front, they don't fill one minibus. and we know that we have four fronts that are called the Palestinian Liberation Fronts. They are between the West Bank, Damascus, and other areas, or the popular struggle front. Those are cartoon factions that have no impact on the ground. Hamas, with other resistance factions, tried to do the same thing and make other factions pro to them, similar to what Mahmoud Abbas did. But there are two other factions that are not part of this formula. They are the democratic formula and the popular front. I believe they need to lift the cover or lift the coverage of Mahmoud Abbas, and they should explain or utter their opposition to Mahmoud Abbas clearly. I believe the current, the generation of Mahmoud Abbas is different from the current, the new generation, and it's proven that all these factions they didn't provide any candidates, lists of candidates, and they don't have the quorum to do that thing. However, the Palestinian people still have a vitality in the elections, and there was a list of independence people. It means that the new generation have a new blood, and the new leadership will come from the resistance, not from the political salons.
Okay, thank you very much. I will give Rabbani later. I will give everyone closing statement for 2 minutes.
Could I just respond to one point that was raised?
Okay, in like 1
just
minute.
very briefly.
Okay, please.
Because Muayin Tahir, both now and in his presentation, put forward the scenario that after Mahmoud Abbas, Israel may seek to reformulate the Palestinian Authority into a series of autonomous cantons that are each directly tied to Israel and perhaps presided over by a warlord or officer rather than a centralized national authority. I completely agree with him. I've felt the same way, and I think this also demonstrates something else, which is that things have now reached a stage where Israel has concluded that it no longer needs a Palestinian partner. I mean, I think the idea behind the Palestinian Authority in the Abbas era was that you would want a Palestinian partner to capitulate and to sign on the dotted line. I think Israel now feels it doesn't even have the need for that anymore. I just wanted to make
Yeah,
that
I agree with you. Thank you for clarifying this. Dr. Balawi, please try to be on the time to have.
Yeah, thank you. I think the first question was about normalization. We are talking about normalization in an Arab and Muslim context. There are so many definitions, you know. Defining something isn't an easy task, but basically we mean by normalization a voluntarily relation with the Israeli occupation authorities that could strengthen and legitimize the occupation. This is in general terms. How do we or how should we deal with those who normalize? If we are talking about states, now it is very difficult to boycott states because there are so many Arab states now who have a sort of relation with the Israeli occupation. So if you boycott all of them, you end up isolating yourself, which is not very wise or practical. But if we are talking about individuals, then I think there are three stages. First one is to declare a stance which is against the act itself, then to discuss and have a dialogue with the person who has done this, and basically, and finally, if he is if he doesn't change his opinion or position, even after discussion and trying to convince him, so the best thing to do, generally speaking, is to boycott him or her. About the visit to Morocco, no, I don't think that it would do much of damage to the Palestinian cause. On the contrary, I think that Palestinians should have dialogues with all Arab countries and even all countries, including the United States, and they should convince those countries and their leadership to stand by the Palestinian legitimate rights and not to isolate themselves. I don't know whether this will do harm or not, but this is my opinion. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. Now I will ask each of you to give a closing statement for 2 minutes. If you don't have maybe anything to add, maybe you can approach one of this question. Since we are talking about the future of the Palestinian struggle, so where do you think the Palestinian, as well as the supporter of the Palestinian around the world, should focus on which element in this struggle against Israel? For example, the BDS, whatever. The second question, where do you see the Palestinian struggle after 10 years? After 10 years, yeah. What would it would be like? Okay, now we will start with Professor Baumgarten. Please, 1 or 1.5 minutes. Can you unmute yourself, please? Yes.
I think the most important thing right now is that the mobilization of people all over the world supporting Palestine, and above all, the mobilization of the Palestinians themselves has to continue. I think that's really the most important thing, and it should be mobilization in all directions. Where will Palestine be in 10 years? Well, as Eric Hobsbawm said, you know, we are not trained to predict the future. We can only look at the present and see in which direction do we go. 10 years from now, the big question will be, how will the state of Israel continue, and what kind of strength will we have in this political system? I think any development on the Palestinian side will be very much dependent on precisely this development, and obviously the question of Palestinian mobilization. Will we have new, rejuvenated political groups and parties active all over? I hope so.
Great, thank you very much. I enjoyed listening to you. Now, Mr. Fanning, please.
Thank you. I was asked to speak about the role of the US, but by way of conclusion, I would say I think it's important to emphasize that the future of Palestine and of its people will not be determined in Washington. It will not be determined at the International Criminal Court here in The Hague. It will be determined first and foremost on the ground in Palestine and in the Middle East, on the basis of either what the Palestinians do or on the basis of what they fail to do. That in turn will have a significant impact on both how the US formulates its policy and whether international institutions decide to continue extending impunity to Israel or to begin holding it accountable. And since I'm not in a position to determine what the Palestinians will do or fail to do, I'm also not in a position to predict over where things might stand a decade from now.
Okay, thank you for being honest. Thank you very much. Mr. Muin Al-Tahir. Can you please unmute yourself, Mr. Muin? Yes.
I think that there are different variables. For example, we may notice that in previous assaults on the Gaza Strip, the Palestinian Authority talked always about so-called random rockets, and it banned any activities in the West Bank that are pro-Gaza. This time we did not witness such actions, and popular uprisings in the West Bank and in the 1948 territories started, and I believe that this indicates very important developments. We noticed that everyone are even using the same terminology as the resistance itself. Sheikh Jarrah is a very important case in point as well. Most importantly, there is a sort of integration. There is no longer a disagreement whether to take up arms or to do otherwise. Everybody stand their position on their front lines, their own fronts. And most importantly, on the other hand, the world changes fast. In South Africa, it took them 30 years to persuade the United States that the regime in South Africa was an apartheid regime, and I believe we can accomplish the same within a shorter span of time. However, as my colleagues mentioned, this all depends on the effort made by the Palestinian people themselves, followed by the support of their friends around the world. But I am confident that although Israel relatively ascended quickly, it shall fall as quickly.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Muin Al-Tahir. Now, the last closing statement from Dr. Plawi.
Well, thank you very much. I was born as a refugee in Jordan. For the first time in my life, I feel very hopeful. And inshallah, after 10 years, we will be in Jerusalem and Quds. It's not only a dream, because I've witnessed a lot of indications, including a better presentation of the Palestinian narrative, maybe also the Palestinian unity, which we have seen behind the resistance, more understanding of the Palestinian suffering and Palestinian cause. And now the Zionist propaganda is completely exposed. Hopefully, we will meet all together after 10 years in a liberated Palestine. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. I believe all of us believe one day Palestine will be free and liberated, maybe except Mahmoud Abbas, I'm not sure. But at least, after the event on Gaza, somehow, on my personal level and my family, we are more having more hope and optimistic about the future, seeing that we are in a new stage in this conflict. Thank you very much. This was a really wonderful panel. I enjoyed this session so much, talking to all of you. I learned from you a lot. Thank you very much. Now we are back to Dr. Yasmin Saad.
Thank you all for participating today, and special thanks for Mr. Fadi for chairing the session. I'd like to invite you to our sixth and final sessions for tomorrow. Session 11 is going to be at 5:30 p.m. Istanbul time, GMT +3. We have a great lineup of speakers, so we hope that you'll be able to join us at that time, followed by the second session on the same day. that will commence at 8 p.m. Again, Istanbul time, and we'll conclude this conference at 10 p.m. tomorrow evening with, again, wonderful speakers who I hope will enlighten us and will add great value to this conference. So please join us tomorrow, and we look forward to seeing you then. Thank you so much.